Joining us right now to talk about further sanctions on Vladimir Putin's economy is Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri. He chairs the Republican Policy Committee. And Senator Blunt, thank you for being here today. Let's start with this, just the atrocities that we are seeing uncovered here. Will these sanctions continue to ratchet up pressure? Will they do anything?
Well, I hope they do. I do think the one thing that won't do anything, frankly, is this idea that somehow Putin is going to be shamed into changing his policies by a UN investigation to the World Court. You know, clearly the World Court of Public Opinion is beginning to understand just how Putin has acted, the wealth he's taken away from the Russian people, and now what he's doing in Ukraine. Did the same thing in Syria, did the same thing in Chechnya, brutal, aggressive, focusing on innocent civilians, hospitals, schools, buildings that they know children are in. It's unbelievable. But what you see in these, as we now recapture, as Ukrainians recapture territory, is mass graves, people with their hands tied behind their backs, shot in the head, that are civilians. Of all ages, all walks of life. It's just unreasonable, and I think we're going to see the rest of the world respond. Europe apparently now prepared to move forward with more oil sanctions, more coal sanctions, trying to deal with the difficult issue that Germany, frankly, got themselves into of being so dependent on Russian natural gas. But Russia has branded itself for who it is under Putin. And they're not going to be able to run away from that, Becky, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, these sanctions are having an impact, at least on the Russian people. We've been hearing about how inflation in Russia is up 15% in very short order since this war's begun. These additional sanctions certainly will eat in. But does it impact Putin? I mean, he has shown a very high tolerance for pain on his people in the past.
Well, he certainly has a high tolerance for pain on the Russian people. You know, what the Russian people have had stolen from them by Putin and the oligarchs, the inability to have that last ability for well over the whole history of Russia to really have the personal freedom they'd like to have, and the personal freedom the Ukrainians are fighting to be sure they can hold on to. You know, they have been subjugated by Russia before. They don't want that to happen again. I think the surprises of the incredible Ukrainian resistance, the poor performance of the Russian military, and NATO coming back really to be prepared to serve its own purposes of defending the NATO countries, and now looking at a neighboring country and doing what they can to help that neighboring country defend itself. Pretty incredible, unanticipated. I think it's going to have big long-term economic consequences, big long-term military consequences as to how we look at military assets, as well as be a big part of the future energy discussion.
A story we have not discussed this morning, one that came out from Reuters, but I think could be key and maybe the most hopeful thing I've seen to date. 6 people told Reuters that some of the Chinese state refiners, we're talking Sinopec, CNOOC, PetroChina, and Sinochem, that they are shying away from new contracts for Russian oil, that they are honoring the contracts that go through May, but they are not buying beyond that, because they are concerned, as Beijing has warned, that these sanctions could have an impact, and you don't want to be tainted with that. Even though they're being offered very low prices for oil, maybe this is the turning sign. Maybe this is a point where China stands up and says no, and if Putin loses Xi as a partner, maybe that actually makes a difference.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how that long-term, irrevocable relationship, or whatever they announced just a few weeks ago lasts. They've never had a good long-term relationship. China certainly will drive a hard bargain when it comes to buying energy and other things from Russia, and they should be concerned about being tainted by what's happening right now in Ukraine. Again, the world's looking at this, understands what they see, and they'll understand who the partners are, and they'll understand who's helping Russia evade sanctions. Those sanctions will get tougher. The Congress needs to come up with its own sanctions so they're actually law rather than done by the president. And the big hang-up on that appears to be what kind of waiver authority the White House is going to continue to insist on. I think Russia's going to pay the price here for a long time, and China shouldn't want to pay that price along with their new closely bonded ally of Russia. It was a big mistake for China to make that commitment without knowing what Putin was going to do, and an even bigger mistake if they did know what Putin was going to do.
All right, let's get back to inflation here in the United States. Today, there is a hearing that's taking place in Congress where they are going to be calling the heads of the major oil companies up to find out why they are price gouging at the pump. What happened there? I mean, is this price gouging to see prices increase like this, or is this a result of what's happened on the oil markets, what we've seen with just higher prices across the board as the economy reopens after COVID? And the Ukrainian war.
Well, I think it's clearly, the basis for it is clearly the Biden energy policies, the policies he announced during the campaign. Energy prices began to go up not the day after the inauguration. They went up the day after the election as people anticipated what would happen if Biden's energy policies became the energy policies of our government. I think by Christmas, Christmas Day, gasoline at the pump was the highest it had ever been. And it had gone up $1.15 a gallon on average before anything happened in Ukraine. These energy policies produced exactly what they would want to produce. In fact, Democrats say we want to drive people away from using fossil fuels. And then Governor Newsom in California, I think this week, said we're thinking about giving subsidies, checks to help people who have cars. It's their own policies would produce the result that they would say they would want them to produce to drive people away from using our traditional energy resources. And then they come up with goofy things like reducing the strategic oil preserve or giving people subsidies to try to offset the inflation, a lot of which is driven by rising energy prices, and the rest, of course, driven by demand. A lot of that in that $1.9 trillion package that Democrats and only Democrats voted for in March to send money directly to people. People wind up, when they get money, they wind up spending money. And if you put that much more money in the economy, that's also going to drive inflation. It's clearly the number one economic and political issue in the country today, and still will be by this time in November.
Senator, wanted to ask you about a different issue that relates to the supply chain, which is labor and COVID. Politico describes you as the Senate's top GOP healthcare appropriator, and you have advocated effectively against spending more money. I mean, the original package that the Biden administration had put forth, and recently said you think that the Biden administration is going to have to actually come back in 60, 90 days to get even more money. Why not come up with a package today that makes sense if this conversation is going to happen all over again in 3 months?
Well, you'd have to ask the Biden administration that. I think, Andrew, this package has gone. One time they said we might need $90 billion, and then they actually publicly suggested they were about to ask for 30, and then they asked for 22, and then they asked for 15, and now down to 10. That we'll probably have to go back and look at this again. I've never understood why this request came the way it did or ratcheted down constantly. Clearly, I think the accounts that they use for therapeutics, for vaccines, for testing, for research have been spent down. I'm for trying to do what we can to restore those accounts, but you certainly can't restore them more than the administration is asking for. And this idea that we're going to repeal Title 42, which is the COVID restriction at the border, but we still need billions more COVID dollars here, really significantly complicated getting this done and probably prevents it from getting done this week.
So what do you think the fair number is that's going to be needed by the time that, if we had this conversation at Christmas time, 2022? Mm-hmm.
I think the fair number, it's hard to know the fair number without knowing what happens in COVID, but I think 10 billion is a minimal number to see how far that gets us. That's what the administration is asking for domestically. I'd like to do it. I think we were really close to being able to get that done, and then CDC announced the change in their view of the impact of COVID. And frankly, that's all some of our members needed to decide, well, we're not going to deal with the COVID issue on spending unless we have a chance to talk about the COVID issue at the border. So if anybody ever wondered if CDC was politically motivated, this would suggest they're politically tone deaf to put that statement out at the same time we're trying to increase by several $billions the COVID spending numbers. And they have spent the money. They've spent it in the categories. Another part of that problem is there's a lot of money in the so-called COVID recovery bill that hasn't been spent, and only about 6% of that $1.9 trillion had anything to do with actual COVID treatment. The rest of it was to drive an economic recovery in an economy that was already obviously well on the way to recovery.
Senator Blunt, want to thank you for your time today.